So here we have a couple of problems, and although they're very straightforward, we want to get into what we call the inverse, right? So if looking at this first problem, we're trying to figure out what is the value of x. Here it's very easy to see that x is 2, but what we're really worried about is, well, how are you getting that? And so if we notice, our main focus is here and trying to get rid of this 1, right? So because it's a positive 1, somehow we got to get rid of it. We got to move it to the other side. So that's what we got to do, the inverse, or in this case, subtract, right? Because the opposite or the inverse of addition would be subtraction. And that's how we get x equals 2. Looking at the second problem, now we're trying to figure out how can we cancel this 3, right? How can we eliminate it? And so to do that, we do the opposite or the inverse of negative 3 or subtracting 3, which is to add 3. And what we do to one side of the equation, we must do to the other side. So on the left side, you can see that they cancel out and we're left with x. On the right side, we are left with 8. Same for multiplication. The inverse of multiplication would be division, or the opposite of multiplication is division. So I'm trying to figure out what's going to cancel, what cancels multiplication. In this case, what cancels 3 multiplied by x. Well, I'm going to divide by 3, right? I'm doing the inverse of that number, and what I do to one side, I must do to the opposite side. And so here, the 3 cancels, and I'm left with x. Same thing on this last problem. So we have division, right? So the inverse of division, or the opposite of division, is to multiply. And in this case, we're going to multiply by 12 on both sides. And I notice on the left side that I'm left with x, right? That was the whole reason of doing the inverse, is to cancel the number and leave the variable. And so on the right side, I simplify 4 times 12 is 48. So that brings us to what is the inverse, right? So the inverse is kind of like something that you do to cancel out a function. And so just when we were working with trig functions, each trig function has its own unique inverse. And so there's 2 ways that we see it, and so we're going to start with probably the one that you're going to see mostly in pre-cal and calculus, which is arc sine, with the keyword being arc, right? So here we have arc sine of, so if you take the arc sine of sine, it's like saying this part right here, the arc sine, is the inverse of this function. And what we do to one side, we must do to the other side, right? And then on the other side, it's just going to be whatever the opposite over the hypotenuse is. Now, the reason we did the inverse, or the reason we did it this way, is because, think about it this way. So the reason we're doing the inverse of sine is to cancel the sine, right? And so once we do that, we're trying to figure out, here my variable is the one that's left. In this case, the variable is the angle measurement that we don't know. So we get theta is equal to, and then on the right side, whatever arc sine is, we can put that in the calculator, and that's going to be our answer, right? So that's one way to see it, is arc sine. A second way that you might see it, and I wouldn't say that is easier, but definitely maybe you might see it more often, is written as sine with the negative exponent, right? So that's also read as sine inverse, and it's still opposite over hypotenuse. So as far as what the inverse is, you still identify sine as opposite over hypotenuse. That does not change. The inverse part is this right here. And yes, there is that particular function in your calculator, and we will talk about it in a bit. Right? So for cosine, we would have arc cosine, right? So arc cosine is going to cancel the cosine. So these 2 cancel, and we are left with theta. And on the right side, whatever arc cosine we put in the calculator, that's what we get when we simplify. And cosine inverse or arc cosine, they mean the same thing, right? But we might see it in 2 different ways. And similar to tan, we have arc tan. The the arc tan and tan cancel. We're left with theta, or the angle that we're looking for. And now here, these are the 2 ways that we might see it. So we can either see it as arctan or tan inverse, and both of these we can put in the calculator to help us out, right? So the inverse here, or the inverse part, we have to remember is, if we want theta, if we want the interior angle, then we are going to take the arc of whatever the trig function is, right? And so the way we identify which trig function we need still